9 a.m., September 19th. In the dimly lit rooms of Estonian radar stations, the morning coffee was still hot when the screens began to bleed red. This wasn't a drill. It wasn't a glitch. 3 Russian MiG-31 Foxhounds had just banked hard south, screaming across the border into Estonian airspace near Vandalu Island. They were ghosts. At least they thought they were. Transponders, dark. Radios, silent. What the Russian pilots didn't know was that NATO hadn't just seen them. They'd been breathing down their necks since the moment their tires left the tarmac at Petrovas. The MiGs carved a path 10 kilometers deep into sovereign NATO territory. They leveled off at 30,000 feet, the sweet spot where their massive Zaslan M radars are most lethal. From his canopy, the lead Russian pilot could likely see the morning sun glinting off the rooftops of Tallinn. Below him, 400,000 Estonians were waking up, pouring cereal, and starting their commutes, completely oblivious to the fact that 500 million rubles worth of Russian hardware was hovering over their heads. This wasn't just a flight. It was a dare. It was a high-stakes bet to see if NATO's Article 5 was a solid shield or just a piece of paper that would fold under pressure. The Russians began to circle. They were playing a psychological game, waiting for Estonian fighters to scramble so they could film aggressive intercepts for their propaganda machines back in Moscow. They were waiting for a fight they could see. They had no idea they were already dead. High above them, 2 Italian F-35 Lightnings, part of NATO's elite standing squadron, were already in the hunt. But there was no radar warning in the Russian cockpits, no beeping alarms. The Italian pilots hadn't even flipped the switch on their active radar. They didn't need to. Instead, they were using the distributed aperture system. 6 high-resolution infrared cameras embedded in the jet's skin gave the Italians a 360-degree digital god complex. Inside their $400,000 augmented reality helmets, the Italian pilots weren't looking at screens. They were looking through the floor of their own planes. They watched the twin Solovyev engines of the MiGs burning at a white-hot 1,200 degrees Celsius. To the F-35, those engines looked like giant neon "kick-me" signs glowing against the cold Baltic sky. The technological gap wasn't just wide, it was a canyon. The F-35's radar cross-section is approximately 0.005 square meters. To a radar, it's the size of a golf ball. Meanwhile, the MiG-31's radar was designed to find B-52 bombers, massive flying warehouses. Trying to find an F-35 with the MiG's radar is like trying to find a specific needle in a haystack using a telescope designed to look at the moon. While the Russians searched the empty sky, NATO's integrated air defense system was tightening the noose. This was a digital hive mind in action. To the east, Finnish F-18s pushed forward. Unlike the Italians, they wanted to be seen. They stayed loud and visible on Russian screens, acting like sheepdogs, herding the MiGs toward the west. To the west, Swedish Gripens sat in total electronic silence over the Baltic. Their radars were off, but they were receiving a crystal-clear picture of the battlefield through Link 16. At 128 time slots per second, the F-35s were feeding the Gripens every move the Russians made. The Estonian controllers didn't have to say a single word over the radio. It was a silent digital execution. It was a 21st century swarm versus 3 Russians using encrypted UHF voice commands like it was still 1975. The Italian F-35s began their cold intercept. No emissions. No fingerprints. Their AN/ASQ-239 Barracuda electronic warfare system was listening to the MiG's own heartbeats. Every time a Russian Zaslan M radar swept the sky, the Barracuda caught it, analyzed it, and told the Italian pilots exactly where the Russians were looking and what they were thinking. The MiG pilots felt the pressure. They kept checking their six, that instinctive over-the-shoulder glance fighter pilots have used since the Red Baron. But there was nothing there, just blue sky and the nagging feeling that they were being watched. 9:12 a.m. The lead Italian pilot finally broke the silence on the International Guard frequency. "Russian aircraft, you are in NATO airspace. Turn east immediately." The Russian lead's response was cold, rehearsed. "We are currently on a scheduled flight." He heard, he understood, but he stayed. In the rigid culture of the Russian military, turning back now would be an admission of guilt. So they kept circling, pretending they owned the sky. Suddenly, their SPO-15 threat receivers, the devices meant to warn them of incoming danger, started having a nervous breakdown. The cockpit was suddenly filled with more beeping than a McDonald's kitchen at lunch hour. The alarms were screaming, but the displays were blank. Random electronic noise was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The F-35s had settled into the MiG's blind spots, directly above them, where the Russian mechanical radars couldn't tilt high enough to see. The Russians were being hunted by ghosts, and the ghosts were about to lose their patience. The lead MiG pilot decided to try the oldest trick in the book, a violent, sudden dive to low altitude. He wanted to hide in the clutter, the messy radar returns that bounce off the ocean waves to confuse old computers. The Italian F-35 pilot didn't even flinch. He didn't even change his altitude. His ANPG-81 radar uses Doppler processing so advanced it can distinguish a 500-knot fighter jet from a 20-knot seagull based on velocity alone. The MiG was screaming toward the water, burning through precious fuel in a desperate, useless maneuver, while the F-35's computer simply adjusted the firing solution in real time. It followed him down like a patient predator watching a wounded animal run in circles. Realizing the dive hadn't shaken a thing, the Russian slammed his throttles forward. Twin engines went into full afterburner, dumping raw fuel into the exhaust to claw for altitude. He was heading for 40,000 feet, the Foxhounds' home turf. Up there, in the thin air, the MiG-31 can theoretically hit Mach 2.83. It's a bullet. It's supposed to be able to outrun anything NATO has. But speed is a lie when your hunter is invisible. As the MiGs climbed, their engines flared like massive torches against the freezing stratosphere. Inside the cockpits, the Russian pilots were shifting from confidence to pure concern. Their threat receivers weren't just beeping anymore, they were having seizures. The Italian F-35s had activated the Barracuda suite's most aggressive feature, digital radio frequency memory. They were capturing the Russian radar pulses and beaming them back with slight delays. 1 second, the Russian radar showed 12 targets. The next, 4. Then none. Then 20. The MiGs were flying into a hall of mirrors. They were surrounded by ghost copies of an enemy they still couldn't see. And that's when the Swedish Gripens decided to introduce themselves. The Swedes had been lurking 80 kilometers away, cold and silent. But the moment the MiGs hit the stratosphere, the Gripens slammed their pulse Doppler radars to maximum power. Inside the Russian cockpits, the warning tones shifted from confused chirping to the steady, high-pitched scream of a hard missile lock. 2 new contacts, bearing 180, closing at supersonic speeds. The tactical reality hit the Russians like a physical blow. They thought they were dealing with 2 invisible Italians. Now they were being boxed in by Swedes from the south and Finns from the east. This was what NATO commanders call a honey trap, using visible threats to flush the enemy directly into the mouth of the invisible ones. Sweden had been a NATO member for what felt like 5 minutes, but they were executing this ambush with the surgical precision of a veteran elite. Through Link 16, the Swedish pilots were seeing exactly what the Italians saw: the MiG's altitude, their exact heading, and even their estimated fuel levels. While the Russians were screaming over UHF radios like it was the Cold War, NATO was operating as a single digital organism. Desperate, the lead MiG attempted to break west toward the open Baltic, hoping to reach international waters where NATO's rules of engagement would tie their hands. But the F-35s were already there. One Italian pilot painted the lead MiG with his targeting radar for exactly 1 second, just long enough to make the Russian pilot's skin crawl, then went dark. Before the Russian could even pull the stick, the second F-35 did the same from the opposite side. Left, right, above, below. The warnings were coming from everywhere. The Russians began yanking and banking, pulling heavy G-forces in defensive turns, their lives literally depending on every maneuver. The second MiG pilot tried one last-ditch effort. He activated his L-203B Gardenia jamming pod. He tried to flood the sky with electronic noise to blind the F-35s. It was a joke. The F-35's AESA radar hops frequencies over 1,000 times per second. Trying to jam it with old Soviet tech is like trying to stop a waterfall with a toothpick. The Italian pilots likely didn't even notice. Their systems filtered out the noise instantly, maintaining a weapons-grade lock while the Russian jammer screamed uselessly into the void. Then, the rest of NATO woke up. The digital hive mind had alerted every squadron in the region. Polish F-16s were screaming off the runways at Malbork. German Typhoons were launching from Leeuwarden. NATO's air command was vectoring them all to the same patch of sky. This wasn't just about Estonia anymore. The Russians had triggered a response that stretched from Stockholm to Rome. The lead MiG pilot made a fatal mistake of ego. He turned his nose toward Tallinn, as if he were going to overfly the capital in a final act of defiance. Big mistake. The moment he pointed his nose at 400,000 civilians, the provocation became a potential strike. The F-35s moved in to herd them. They didn't just block the path, they used the Russians' own fear against them. An F-35 would spike them from the left, forcing the MiGs to break right. Then a spike from below forced them to climb. The Russians were being moved like pawns on a chessboard by an opponent they still hadn't seen with their own eyes. Suddenly, the red low fuel lights began to flicker in the Russian cockpits. They had been burning afterburners for 15 minutes. In a MiG-31, that's a death sentence for your range. Kaliningrad was 400 miles away. At their current burn rate, they had maybe 18 minutes of flight time left before their jets became very expensive gliders. The smart move? Ask for help. Declare an emergency. But in Putin's military, asking NATO for a place to land is a one-way ticket to a gulag. So they stayed in the air, watching their options evaporate like jet fuel in an afterburner. That's when the Poles arrived. The Polish F-16s didn't come in quiet. They came in with pure electromagnetic hostility. They locked onto the MiGs immediately. For the Polish pilots, this wasn't just an intercept. It was historical payback delivered at Mach 1.5. Simultaneously, German Typhoons dropped from the high heavens. These weren't stealth jets, and they didn't care. The Typhoon was built for air superiority. With twin Eurojet engines pumping out 40,000 pounds of thrust, they took the high ground, looking down on the MiGs like hawks watching mice.
The Russians were now surrounded by 10 NATO fighters from 5 different nations. Italians they couldn't see, Swedes to the south, Poles to the west, Germans above, Finns to the east. The lead Italian F-35 pilot decided the lesson was over. He switched his radar to single target track, pouring enough energy onto the lead MiG to cook a turkey at 30 kilometers. Inside the MiG, the threat receiver hit a continuous, soul-crushing tone. It's the sound every pilot fears. It means an AIM-120D AMRAAM missile has a 97% probability of turning your cockpit into confetti. For 5 seconds, the Italian held the lock. 5 seconds for the Russian pilot to realize that his entire life was now a rounding error in a NATO computer. The Russian lead finally broke. His voice crackled over the emergency frequency, returning to base. But NATO wasn't letting them go that easily. This was going to be the longest flight of their lives. As the MiGs turned toward Kaliningrad, the Swedish Gripens tucked in just 500 meters off their wing. They were close enough to count the rivets on the Russian airframes. Swedish Rafael Lightning pods began recording everything in high definition: tail numbers, weapon loads, electronic pods. Every detail would be filed under "What happens when you mess with NATO." At the Polish border, the F-16s took over the escort. They kept their missile locks hot the entire way home. It's called an aggressive escort in the manuals. In the cockpit, it's called trolling. The MiGs were forced to fly at maximum range cruise, barely above idle, just to keep from falling into the sea. The Polish F-16s had to keep popping their speed brakes just to stay slow enough to follow them. As they approached Kaliningrad, Russian Su-27s scrambled to meet them, likely expecting to greet heroes. Instead, they found 3 exhausted MiGs being escorted to the door, like delinquents being walked to the principal's office. The Italian F-35s, still invisible, watched the MiGs disappear into Russian airspace before banking west toward home. They had been in the air for 2 hours. They still had half a tank of gas, and they hadn't even broken a sweat. The Baltic is no longer a playground. It is a NATO lake. And as 3 Russian pilots just learned the hard way, you don't visit without permission, you don't stay without supervision, and you definitely don't leave without an escort. Bye for now.